Only a select few Canadians have flown as high, literally in their career, than our next guest, the first Canadian in outer space. And when not exploring space, he spent 15 years as a respected parliamentarian exploring how to make life better for Canadians. Marc Garneau is now letting us into his incredible career and his personal life in a new book called A Most Extraordinary Ride, Space, Politics, and the Pursuit of a Canadian Dream. Marc Garneau joins us now. Thank you so much for being here.
A pleasure.
As you can see from my book here, I've made many notes. And so in speaking with you, it was very overwhelming because there are so many hats that you have worn. I want to begin in the very beginning, and that is your dedication. You wrote your book for your kids, my understanding, the dedication to my children, as I promised. Is as I promised that you were to write this book, or as you promised that you would dedicate it to them?
As I promised to write the book.
Okay.
Yeah. About 15 years ago, I was talking to my mother and I said, I don't know much about your first 30 years of life. And it was like pulling teeth to get her to talk about it, but she had such a rich life, and I realized my children don't know very much about my first 30 years, and that's why I wrote it.
Which is so funny considering you are so public-facing, and a lot of the public feels like they know you, but maybe they don't know the first bit on how you got to become who you are. So let's talk a little bit about you and how you got to, well, everyone wants to talk about space, I know that, but things weren't necessarily easy in the beginning. You were a rebellious kid. You learned some lessons along the way that got you to where you were. What did that teach you in your upbringing, where maybe it wasn't, there were trials and tribulations that you said, I need to straighten things out a little bit and I need to go toward this path? How did that all work, that process for you?
So I made a number of mistakes when I was a young person growing up, and those, in some cases, could have had the potential of just changing the direction of my life. I was a bit of a rebel, but when I did make the mistakes, I learned from them. And fortunately, I had parents and friends and teachers who helped get me back on the straight and narrow. And I wanted my children to know that it happens to everyone. We all experience failures or problems in our life. It's not the end of the world. If you learn from it, it can actually be a benefit. And I think it helped to shape me as an adult.
Now we talk about your successes. The day, October 5th, 1984, on board the Space Shuttle Challenger, you became the first Canadian in space. When people say, this is almost 40 years ago.
Yes.
Can you take us back to that day? Had you known just how enormous of an impact this would have on the future?
I didn't at the time. I realized, being the first, that it was kind of an historical moment, but I really didn't appreciate, because I wasn't far enough removed to look back. Now, 40 years later, I'm very proud of the fact that I was the first, and that since then, many other Canadians have flown in space. And, you know, guess what? In a couple of years, Jeremy Hansen, the Canadian, will become the first non-American to go as far as the moon. So we've come a long way, and I'm very proud of that.
Speaking of space exploration and the future of, are we at a place, you know, if you were to go back 1985 and say, in 40 years, I would like to see this. In 40 years, I would hope we would have discovered this. Are we anywhere close to that? Or do you think we have several years to go before we can make these discoveries?
I think we're making incredible progress. If you like, on the non-human side, with telescopes like the Hubble Space Telescope or now the James Webb Space Telescope, yes, we're learning so much about our universe. On the human side, we're now going to go back to the moon. When we went to the moon in the 60s, it was because it was a race between the Soviet Union and the United States, who could get there first. Right. Now we're going to go back to the moon and do all sorts of other things. And many other countries are going to participate. So we've had the International Space Station. So I think we're making progress.
And the investment is so important these days. Sometimes you speak to Canadians and they're just focused on, obviously, as they should, what's happening domestically, and we'll talk about internationally as well as your time as Foreign Affairs Minister. But why is it important to make the investment for the everyday person? You know, someone who says, well, why are you spending millions, billions of dollars looking out there when we need to be looking here? What do you say to them?
Well, I usually pull out my cell phone and I say, do you know why you can call anybody on the planet from this device? Do you know why you can figure out on this device exactly where you're standing on the surface of the planet? Do you know why we understand when hurricanes are coming? It's all because of spacecraft up there, that invisible infrastructure. We don't see it, but it makes our lives better. And in Canada, the second largest country on earth, it really has made a big difference.
Yes. Let's talk about your time now in politics. And, it was just as of recent, though it feels like a world ago when you look at your career, serving as transport minister, most recently foreign affairs minister. In a piece of your book, you did write, I believe Justin Trudeau has overestimated Canada's impact abroad. Without giving the context to the chapter, because I want to give away all of your sentiments here, can you talk a little bit about what you mean by that and some of the relationships with the ministers, with the cabinet, with the PM, with the PMO, and then what we look like on a world stage?
Well, first of all, I thoroughly enjoyed my career in politics. But when I was foreign minister, of course, you're dealing with other countries. And I had the perception that Canada's sort of position in the world had slipped a bit. And I think it's something that we can correct, but we need to do a number of things. I was delighted to find out, for example, the Prime Minister is now in the ASEAN countries in the Indo-Pacific. That is really good, because I think the center of gravity of the world is shifted towards that part of the world. And it's important for us to know more about countries like China and India and the ASEAN countries, because it's in Canada's interests from a trade point of view, from a security point of view, and I'm glad that's happening, but I think we're playing catch up a bit.
Yes. The state of politics, no matter where you look, but let's clearly look at Canada, given your experience. The polling numbers we've seen with the Liberals have been dipping significantly. We have an election. It is looming. We've heard from the Prime Minister say, you know, resolute in that he's going to stay on as leader. Do you believe that's the right move?
I think he's dead set on running as the Liberal leader for the next election. Look, the truth is that when a government has been in power for 9 years, whether it's this government or Mr. Harper's government or Mr. Martin's government before that, there's a certain fatigue that sets in the population, and people think, well, maybe it's time for a change. And what I would say is that, you know, when that election happens in the next year, I hope Canadians will look carefully at what each has to offer. Because it's one thing to complain about the current situation, and there are things to complain about, but I think we should insist on knowing, well, what would that party do that will make it better?
Sure. Do you believe your role in politics is over? Could you foresee anything down the road in any capacity where you could jump back in?
No, definitely
Easy
not.
answer.
No, I've been engaged in my professions, Navy, space, and politics for 58 years. Now I'm enjoying my family.
I love this. I want to read one part in your book, and this is one of the final days as a politician, and this was one of your address, or your address, I should say, at the UN General Assembly. I just want to read a little excerpt because I love it, and I want to leave the interview on this. You said, "We must look toward the future with optimism, just as our parents and grandparents stepped up to the challenge of their moment. So too must we recognize and seize our own opportunity to shape the future." Those words, I'm sure, ring true for you in so many different ways.
Absolutely.
What would you like to say to our Canadians that are watching, and what those words mean for you and what our future entails, what it involves?
What I would say is that we are probably the most fortunate people on earth as Canadians to live in such a wonderful country, to be in a democracy, to have vast resources, to have so much beauty in our country. And it's important that we help other countries at the moment. And I'm very proud of our multicultural approach in this country, our compassion, our safety net. And although we sometimes get cynical, it's important to realize that if you look at other countries, Canadians are so fortunate. And it's because of Canadians, because we've made the country that way. And I hope we will continue to keep it that way.
Well said. Marc Garneau, the book out now. Do get yourself a copy without all these. Get yourself a new copy. Thank you so much. An honor to meet you, and thank you for coming in.
My pleasure, Melanie.
Appreciate it.